Speaking of CNN, this weekend its coverage of the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma, it had some bells and whistles, like this. The first time the FAA approved use of a drone in news coverage. Our TV and web audiences right now are looking at some pretty beautiful video of an empty Edmund Pettus Bridge. It looked cool and pretty, and sometimes there were some cool things going on there, but was this a case of doing something cool simply because we could? There were bells and whistles that we could go ahead and take advantage of, but there's not a whole lot of context to what we're looking at right here.
You know, this particular video that we're looking at right now with the flyover of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I mean, it's really kind of interesting video, and the music behind it is very thoughtful, and then the graphics that are on there sort of spelling out the history, the timeline. It's all fine. The problem was how CNN decided to promote it. I mean, constantly their reporters and their anchors were talking about, look at us, we've got this drone up there, look at us, it's about the drone, when it really should have been about the 50th anniversary.
And I think that's where I have the problem. It's not about the organization that's doing the news, it's about the story itself. And if they would have concentrated on that and let the images and the words that they use speak for themselves and then cover the event, I think they would have gotten a lot more out of it than, hey, let's promote CNN and our use of a drone.
No, I mean, I thought actually that this, as a use of a drone, and as I said, the purposes of news coverage, this is one of the first opportunities for large organizations, news organizations to do it in this country. That is fine, and that's the kind of thing you would want to use that technology for. You just don't need the ceaseless beating of your own drum. You're inviting ridicule.
And I think the problem that CNN and several of the other cable news organizations are having right now is that they're spending a lot of time trying to promote their brand, and their brand is being exclusive to this kind of reporting or this kind of coverage of this event or that event, and that should not be the story if you're saying that you're a news organization. And I think they're sort of presenting themselves in one way, and the audience is starting to see, wait a minute, it's all more about you than it is about the story.
I must say, though, CNN is not the only one who's guilty of this.
No, they're not.
If you look on our links blog, Amy, you've got a post there from USA Today, and within that story of their 50th anniversary piece, stuck right in the middle of it is this note about how we're using a 360-degree camera, and you can slide your mouse over it, and you can watch people from any angle. So what? It's just that we're so desperate to see if any of these new technologies, drones, 360 cameras, virtual reality, 3D, something can generate more revenue for the news industry.
Yep.
So let's talk about some of the coverage that maybe brought in some more of the context or some of the stories that resonated a little bit more, specifically stood out.
Well, I think, speaking of USA Today and the stories on our links blog, I think one of their reporters did a really good story of looking at what's happened to Selma since the march, since Bloody Sunday, and the fact that poverty is even worse now than it was at that time. About what happened in terms of white flight, what's happened to that area in general in terms of economic development moving away, and that I think is more of a story that resonates today, where you take what happened from a historical perspective and then bring it into the present and then talk about what could possibly happen in the future. There were very few of those stories out there. A lot of them talked about the president's speech, which was a very good speech. A lot of them talked about who was there and who wasn't there in terms of you had a lot of Democrats there.
Turning it into a political story.
Then I read one story about how, I think it was the New York Times, cropped out former President George W. Bush, when in fact they didn't crop him out.
And there's a whole lot of information on our links blog about that specifically, too.
I mean, we might talk about that a little bit. I mean, it just was ludicrous that Fox News was, of course, the one pointing this out, that somehow they had decided to leave out President Bush. He and Laura Bush were on the front line, but they were way far away from President Obama, right? And so you have to think, what's the explanation that the New York Times gave? Was it some conspiracy of trying to not show Republicans, or was it the fact that, as the Times photographer put it, the light wasn't right and it was reflecting more off of Bush in that particular shot? He didn't even submit that photo. It wasn't that they cropped it. And if you read the New York Times story, for all you conspiracy theorists out there who believe everything you see on Fox News, just read it. It talks about President Bush being there. It talks about other Republicans being there. It is not a one-sided story.
And that was the problem that I had, is that some of the journalism got drawn into the political atmosphere that's going on right now in terms of Democrats and Republicans, both within state legislatures as well as in the national government. And they took an event, they took a story which really could resonate about what happened historically, where we are now, like I said earlier, and they took that story and just turned it into this political back and forth gamesmanship. And I think that's where journalism loses a lot of its luster, because people don't want to read that and they back off and they say, hey, I don't want to read or hear any more about the infighting going on. Give me something else.
Right.